Chapter 15, Doug, Winter Driving, Dawn, Day 1. Doug's four-wheel drive had already been warming up in the driveway. It didn't have chains on and didn't really need them unless in the strictest of circumstances. He stomped over to the passenger side and let Challenger in after she went potty near what resembled a snow-shaped tree in the yard. All Doug had to do was hold the door open and pat on the seat for a second, and in barreled the dog. Doug shut the door carefully behind Challenger and stomped around to the other side and got in. Doug turned the station to the news and turned on the radio in his vehicle and turned on his comms in his vehicle in case anything needed to be radioed in or out. A lot of people had given up on cell phones at this point due to unreliability and disasters, or the fact that the government seemed to shut them off at will with no transparency. He had a special cell phone on an emergency band, but didn't need it besides verifying call-out info. Only people you could call with it when the towers got congested were other people with the same network and plan, which didn't do anyone any good. Doug put his truck in drive and patted on his dog on the head, and slowly they went. Doug had preset the drive system to its four-wheel setting, and it felt completely stable. There would be stop signs here and there, but there was an art to driving in the snow. You would let your foot off the gas and listen. If you didn't hear anything, you just kept coasting through. Stopping usually meant getting stuck. Hardly nobody was out on the roads. The early birds were already in the ditch, and everyone else was staying home. School was already canceled in this area as a knee-jerk reaction. For anyone who actually still went to school on site. Which didn't really matter either way. Doug considered helping every second or third person he passed in the ditch, but there was no time. They were all idiots for trying to maintain normalcy when literally everything around them was a sign that they needed to reevaluate the situation. Was their stupid dead-end job really that important? Did the boss really need his or her whatever at 8 a.m.? Of course not. They were all idiotic, unprepared sheep, and they were paying for it. But what was Doug doing? He thought about it for a minute. He was going to save people that needed help. What was the difference? Doug pondered some more. The difference was that people he was helping actually prepared for the eventuality and thus had pre-planned help on the way. All these people he passed in the ditch had no help and no preparation. Disaster planning was an afterthought to them, and now they were paying the minor inconvenience of a price. They wouldn't die, of course. State Patrol or the city or the police department or the sheriff's department had them on some list somewhere and was helping them out in the order the idiots got stuck. They probably had something to snack on. They probably had a kid's jacket or something they could throw over their nylon leggings, yoga pants, or khakis. They'd call their boss and say they got stuck, and that would automatically make their stupid deadline slip acceptable. Insurance would cover all the easily avoidable wrecked cars. Everyone's premiums would go up, everyone would pat themselves on the back for trying and deflect responsibility, and then all of them would do it again tomorrow. Doug shook his head at the idiots and looked over at his puppy. Well, she wasn't a puppy anymore, that's for sure. She grew up quick, and she was turning into an absolute massive handful. Challenger looked back at him with her big doe eyes, like every day was the best day of her life. Doug reached over while looking at the road to pat her on the head. She instead devoured his hand. She didn't bite down, she just inhaled his hand. He didn't even bother trying to pull out, just shoved it in a little more and then gently pulled it out. He looked at her and she looked back at him like it was pretty funny. Doug gave her a funny look and tried again. She let him pet her this time after he wiped the slime off on her, which she seemed to like. "You're a weird dog," Doug said. She made some kind of rumbling noise that sort of sounded affectionate, and then looked back out the window. She was making nose shapes and a breath fog on the window. She clearly wanted to go out and play, but thought this was acceptable for now. Doug was happy he was able to get the approval to bring her along. Usually dogs were nuisances at events unless they were highly controlled, but in search and rescue they were invaluable. All he had to do was send her to a super expensive class and get her certified. It was all reimbursed by work, fortunately. The last canine unit they had suddenly dropped off the grid and wasn't responding, so Doug was next in line. Thankfully, he was able to bill his training back to the company that he worked for under first responder credits, so it all worked out. Plus, he got a super trained dog out of the deal. He didn't tell anybody she was actually full wolf, probably against tons of laws. Every time they asked what breed Challenger was, he'd always agree with whatever their guess was. For training and the official doggy certificate, she actually needed a few years, but there wasn't that kind of time, so she got the crash course. It was good enough, compared with her natural instincts. Doug couldn't wait to see her in real action. Doug took a few more turns at a slow pace and passed a few more cars that were in the ditch. He kept going and didn't even look. He was getting on the freeway now and needed to focus. The on-ramp was always where everyone wiped out. He passed 3 more cars which were in the ditch and had to let out a chuckle. The tow trucks were going to make a mint in the morning and probably tomorrow too. Doug shook his head in disbelief. The freeway was always a trick in itself. The semis were flying by in full chains, chewing up the snow and ice easily. The snow was coming down at about a medium pace, and the windshield wipers could keep up in normal city conditions. But on the freeway, it was a different story. Doug had to flip the wiper speed up to high as he felt like he was driving through a flurry. The cars were in the right lane in the ice like idiots. They were plowing into each other and into the beginnings of snowdrifts every quarter mile or so. It was like nobody had ever driven in the snow before. The semis were in the left lane. The cars couldn't drive in that lane because their wheelbases wouldn't line up properly, and they couldn't keep up anyway with the low center clearance shoving against the snow that the semis were passing over. Doug's truck had the comparably spaced wheelbase and the right clearance and could keep up with the speed of the giant tractors easily. He could see their taillights easily, and they could see him, and he drove in their ruts all the way to work with the flurry going right on over him. He got to his exit and passed 3 more people in the ditch as the off-ramp turned into ice. He slowed back down with a little time to spare before the skating rink as the city began turning into ice. It was a lot colder here than the warmer area a few hundred miles to the north where the storm actually was, but the city was a little warmer than his house where he'd driven from, so it was icy here, but not accumulating quite as much. Basically, the warm moisture from the snow was hitting the cold air in his weather pattern, and he was stuck on the cold side. He coasted through a few more intersections carefully, with not as much audio cues for safety awareness. He could hear the radio again. The talk was that the storm up north was one of the worst storms ever to hit. The snowstorm was heavy but contained in a sort of gorge. Law enforcement was asking everyone to stay home that could stay home unless in an emergency. Emergency crews would be out to clear the roads in a few days as the snowplow trucks had been decommissioned by the mayor again. No de-icing had been put on the roads. No trucks had been prepared. Everything was awesome, like usual. Doug pulled around a corner and saw the appropriate parking garage. There were guards right inside the parking garage, which was definitely unusual. They waved to Doug to stop and ask to see his ID. Doug showed them his ID. Doug was on the list apparently, which was a positive. The guards told Doug to proceed to the roof and meet the next contact. The guards motioned to the guard shack, and then the gates lifted and they waved Doug through. As he started through the parking garage, he heard them radio codes back and forth. As Doug found the ramp to ascend, he thought about it and assumed they were radioing up to notify them that he was coming up. Doug went up one ramp, then another, and he lost count of the ramps, and suddenly he was back in the snow again, was at a much higher elevation again, and there was quite a flurry going on. Doug kept a slow pace and drove up the ramp safely. There seemed to be a few other signs of people driving up here this morning, but not many. In the distance, as the middle of the roof of the parking garage, there was a helicopter. As Doug got closer, he noticed this wasn't simply any helicopter. It was one of those huge 16-seaters. He'd heard them seating up to 20 people, depending on the configuration, but then there was less room for gear. They could hold around 8,000 pounds, which was plenty for a 12-man team in full gear. Doug parked, got out, and put Challenger's Ear Pro and Eye Pro on it, and let her out. Challenger started tromping around in the snow, smelling and trying to find a secluded place to potty. Looking around for someone who seemed to be in charge, Doug saw that everyone appeared to be in the helicopter waiting. No doubt the cold didn't accommodate everyone hanging out outside. Doug climbed back into the truck and got his bag and locked the truck up, and then started heading over to the helo. He tried to line up with the pilot to make eye contact, since nobody was outside to guide him into the helicopter. The pilot was wearing night goggles and saw Doug approach, and then stopped to kneel about 50 meters away. Challenger saw all this and wanted to check out the new situation that Doug was heading towards. She galloped over to him and the multiple feet of snow that had been in the process of accumulating, her paws spreading out wide so she could get extra traction and momentum. She was covered in snow and the happiest dog in the universe, apparently completely fearless of the mammoth machine making miniature snow tornado.